I'm Max Gunther. In recent times, we've heard a lot of stories about Black Lives Matter, as well as the militarization of police. So, a bit of background on this topic is in Ferguson, Missouri, a black teenager by the name of Michael Brown was shot in April of last year. He was shot by a police officer of the name of Darren Wilson, and Michael Brown and his friend Dorian Johnson robbed a store and then were running away, evading police when Michael Brown was killed. Now, Ferguson, Missouri has a large African American community, so the response to a white police officer shooting a black kid was protesting. So there was a lot of looting, a lot of violence, a lot of arrests that were made at the time. And Black Lives Matter was sort of a group that spawned around the same principle that African American or black adults were disproportionately killed by police and disproportionately thrown in jail, arrested, and all sorts of discrimination is going on across the country. So what Black Lives Matter does is they do different kinds of protests. Some of the protests are nonviolent, some of the protests are effective, but some of the protests block traffic, and that's a pretty big issue because in some cases it can lead to harm to infrastructure as well as harm to other people. So Black Lives Matter is a group that's staged traffic protests in Los Angeles, Chicago, Oakland, San Francisco, Seattle, as well as Boston. A bit of the problems that are going on is that the police response has been disappointing at best. So police have responded in a number of different ways to the Missouri Ferguson shootings and then subsequent protests. The governor actually authorized the use of the Missouri State Highway Patrol to come in and try to quell the protests. So essentially send in these state troopers with riot gear to try to quell protests, arrest citizens, try to keep the peace. And that kind of response isn't exactly what people want to hear in any community, really. The fact that, you need to call in help to enforce law and order is kind of disappointing. So there's a lot of backlash on both sides because Black Lives Matter doesn't always not protest nonviolently, as well as the police aren't always right in the things that they do. So another case that was important to Black Lives Matter, as well as the entire the issue of police violence against citizens, is the Freddie Gray case. So Freddie Gray was a big guy. He was 6'4", and he had had a little bit of experience with other officers. So he was arrested, and then he was restrained and transported around for 45 minutes in the back of a police car. Now, the police car made a number of stops before getting to the police station, and upon arrival at the police station, it was found that Gray was in very critical condition, and he needed to be transported to a hospital where he eventually died. So 6 officers were charged in this case, and as of right now, all of them have been found not guilty of any crime. and this was just a actual person who was in police custody and died because of being in police custody. So the response of, the legal system to say nobody is at fault for this person dying is incredibly distressing to all kinds of people, because, you imagine, what if that was me? What if somebody I knew was transported around by police and died? I'd definitely care about that. I'd definitely want to do something. Black Lives Matter believes that the black voices of the community should be heard. They believe that they should gather attention. Black voices are being silenced everywhere. They're being overpowered, and so part of their protest tactic is to fight back. So they've fought back with different traffic protests where they stop traffic from moving at all, and they basically close down major highways for their protest movement. And so this is actually sort of pretty damaging to infrastructure, not long term, but in terms of short term. People can't get into work, people can't go home, people can't go anywhere. And this did become an issue when they prevented ambulances from driving to major hospitals. Boston has tons of major hospitals around, and recently in the Boston protest of Black Lives Matter, there was an ambulance en route with transporting a child to Boston Children's Hospital, and they were blocked by this protest. This sort of thing seems unacceptable. The ambulances have been blocked, carrying people, rushing people to hospitals in Oakland and Memphis as well. I haven't heard any stories about ambulances in other cities being blocked, and I'm not sure if there were critical hospitals in the key paths of where the protesters were, but this is an issue that seems like it's hard to deal with and hard to work around. Obviously, it's horrible if anybody's life would be put in danger because of a protest. And this isn't the only response of violent protest. So the new Black Panther Party, which is the party, it was in Ferguson, and they were planning the mass protests there. When the grand jury decision decided not to indict Darren Wilson of any crime for the shooting and death of Michael Brown, several new Black Panther Party members were arrested with explosives and illegally obtained guns. There was recently a shooter in Houston who associated himself with Black Lives Matter and began shooting police officers, specifically white police officers. And this held up streets for hours until he was finally taken out by an explosive device. And this sort of violence is unacceptable in our community, and there needs to be something done about it. There needs to be some kind of, check on police officers so that they can't kill people without consequences, and there needs to be a check on protesters so that they don't endanger people with their protests. As far as police immunity goes, there's the term qualified immunity comes into play. It essentially states that any police officer wearing a badge in a uniform doing their job is immune from any law. And so far, this has been the case. This means that in order to sue a police officer, a citizen needs to either get the Department of Justice to investigate this police officer. Internal Affairs also can investigate, and they would then, go to jail if found responsible, or more likely they would get transferred, lose their job potentially, potentially get a paid vacation, and in some rare cases, unpaid vacation, which seems incredibly unfair that people could, commit a crime, then face no consequences, and get paid leave for committing said crime. In 2014, a NYU law study found that officers responsible for committing crimes, or officers responsible for negligence, misconduct, etc., ended up having to pay their victims less than 0.02% of the time. So police officers face pretty much no consequences for committing any crimes, and they face no consequences for killing anyone. There are numerous advantages to communications, however, and what people need to realize is that communicating is the only way to properly handle this, is there needs to be dialogues between communities, between police, between Black Lives Matter and police, between regular citizens and police, and that people's perception of whether or not the police are there to get you or there to help you is incredibly important. I would like to say that all forms of violent protest is bad. Hurting somebody else because you feel like you were hurt more by the police is wrong. As well as police militarization is bad. It's standard for police departments to become armed with assault rifles. Every officer in Los Angeles Police Department was given a huge budget for guns, as well as several districts were given submachine guns for their police. Now, I mean, Los Angeles isn't the worst place in the world, but there's not an amount of criminals that any police officer would need a submachine gun to fight them. And there's plenty of accidental deaths. There's plenty of people who have been recorded complying and then still died anyways. The only way to deal with this, the only way to really face this issue is through dialogue, is through open networks between police, between Black Lives Matter, between any group that feels that there is a problem. And there are a lot of groups, and there are a lot of problems. Black Lives Matter needs to open a dialogue with the police. They need to be willing to listen. They need to be willing to actually accept help and not inconvenience other people and potentially kill children. If ambulances can't make it to a hospital and need to transport a child to a hospital, then they are killing the child by blocking the ambulance. So, in conclusion, people need to step up their communicating game. People need to be talking with each other. People need to be talking with outreach programs. Police need to be talking with people. Police need to be held accountable for their actions. And the only ways that they can do it is if they are forced to discuss. They are forced to sit down in a room with some of the people who believe that they have been wronged and talk about it and have an open mind for discussion and an open mind for nonviolent action.